Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today I am going to bring you through my April wrap-up. I haven't always been doing wrap-ups on the channel because I made this channel to try to focus on fantasy, and what I read on a monthly basis is fairly eclectic. So sometimes I do reviews of the books that I have read, sometimes I talk about some of the books but not others. But this month was just a really solid reading month, and I think that most of these books are books that are really worth reading. So I wanted to give you a full rundown of the month of April. And it's also helpful that I read a lot less this month than I typically do. So I read only 8 books and many of them were quite short. So I feel like I can talk about them without this video being 35 minutes long. I will just start with the first book that I read this month and end with the last book that I read this month. And I really hope that you find something that sparks your interest or a new book that you would like to check out. The first book that I read of the month is one that I actually did a dedicated review for on the channel, and that is Legend by David Gemmell. So I will link my review video here so that if you haven't checked that out and if you're interested in reading Legend, you can go and get a spoiler-free rundown of why I think you should read it. But I will just say that I thought this book was fantastic. This is an 80s fantasy written by David Gemmell, and it centers around the legendary character of Druss. So the setup for the novel is that the Draenei Empire, which has been in power for many, many years, is on the brink of an invasion by a people known as the Nadir. And the Nadir have gathered in this giant horde and are marching to infiltrate the Draenei Empire. And unfortunately, in their management of the land, the Draenei Empire has become very lax. Their army is kind of in shambles, and they can think of no good way to stop this invasion and this takeover from happening. So the Duke of the giant fortress of Dros Del Nock writes to his old friend Druss the Legend and urges him to come out of retirement and help defend the fortress and prevent the Nadir from infiltrating the Draenei Empire. This is a book that focuses on a character who is past his prime, so a character in the aftermath of their glory who has already become this legendary figure and is entering back into the battle fray. So it's a very different perspective than your typical heroic fantasy characters. And I thought that that was a really fascinating story to follow. There are a couple of other main characters, including a young swordsman who has recently fallen in love, about the young woman that he is in love with, and about a group of magic users. But the star of the show, and where a lot of the kind of themes coalesce, is around this character of Druss. If you have been wondering whether or not this is a worthwhile piece of classic fantasy to read, I think it very much is. I think that it is still very accessible, and I think a lot of the themes that are explored are still highly relevant today. So I would 100% recommend anybody to pick this up. I had a great time reading it, and if you are going to read anything from this TBR, then I really think you should check it out. I know that David Gemmell is a big favorite of John Gwynne, a heavy inspiration. So if you have enjoyed his Faithful and the Fallen series, or if you have enjoyed his recently released Shadow of the Gods, then definitely pick up Legend and give it a try. The second book that I read for the month was Archer's Goon by Dianna Wynne Jones. The only book by Dianna Wynne Jones that I had read before this point was Howl's Moving Castle, and I had seen the film before reading the book, and I really, really love that movie. So while I enjoyed the book, I felt like I couldn't objectively separate it from the love that I had for the movie. And one of my favorite authors, Neil Gaiman, was a very good friend to Dianna Wynne Jones, and he cites her as one of his biggest inspirations and one of the aspirational writers for him. So a writer to whom he looked up a lot and who he tried to emulate. And I will say, after reading this book, I can definitively say that Dianna Wynne Jones has to have one of the brightest imaginations in fantasy and one of the most distinctive voices in fantasy. You could not pick up a book by Dianna Wynne Jones and mistake it for a piece of writing by anyone except Dianna Wynne Jones. She has such a singular voice and it brings her stories to life. This book, Archer's Goon, is about a young boy named Howard Sykes who arrives home from school one day to find out that a mysterious figure known as the Goon is sitting at his kitchen table. And this Goon has been sent by a second mysterious figure named Archer in pursuit of 2,000 words worth of writing from Howard's father, who is a writer of stories. And so what unfolds is that these words have allegedly gone missing and they become the center of a plot by a group of warring, wizarding siblings who are all relegated to certain areas of the city. So they all have their domain in the city and they seem to be tied to these domains, and their imprisonment seems to be linked to these words that are written by Howard's father. So this is a very whimsical, kooky unfolding of a mystery that centers around these magical siblings, around Howard and his family, and around the idea of writer's block that plays a very prominent role in the book, about family, about connection. And it's just fantastic. On Goodreads, I gave this book 5 stars. It is so good, and it made me regret the fact that it has taken me so long to explore more of Dianna Wynne Jones's writing. I will definitely seek out more of her books. I would say that this is probably marketed as a middle grade novel. That's likely where you would find it in the bookstore. But I truly think that this is one of those classic works of fantasy that transcends any categorization. I think that you could read this with your children. I think you could read it on your own. I think kids could read it on their own. It is just the kind of book that anyone could enjoy, and I really highly recommend that you check it out and then tell me what you thought about it. The third book of the month for me was a work of literary fiction, and that is All of Kitteridge by Elizabeth Strout. So one of my personal reading goals over the last X number of years has just been to work my way through the list of Pulitzer Prize winning novels, and All of Kitteridge is one that has been on my list for quite some time, and I'm really glad that I finally got the chance to pick it up. So this is, as I said, literary fiction that is really a collection of short stories that are all linked in some way, either large or small, to the central character of Olive Kitteridge. And Olive is a school teacher, and this takes place over a huge amount of time. So she goes from being a school teacher to a retired school teacher in the various stories, who lives in New England. And I will say that this is very accessible in terms of themes, writing, approach. So it's a very easy piece of literary fiction to get lost in. The small short stories make it very easy to digest. It's very quick to go through. You can read one story at a time and kind of fly through it in that way. But it is also very depressing. It talks a lot about, or it explores the idea of regret, of our interpersonal relationships, and the ways that our own experiences can get in the way of us truly connecting with others. It talks about some of the harder parts of aging, of how our relationships change over time. And I thought, right up until the final few stories, that I was not going to rate this as highly as I did, because it seemed like it was all bleak. It was a really frightening look at what it's like to age, and I thought, if this is what the world has in store for me, then I'm not really interested. But the last couple of stories do add that kernel of hope that I think tied all of the stories and tied the novel together quite well. I have to say that I dislike the character of Olive intensely, but I think Elizabeth Strout did a really good job of humanizing her, of offering up places where we could feel some empathy for her and her choices. And altogether, it was just a brilliantly done novel. The fourth book that I read for the month of April is Dragonsbane by Barbara Hambly. And I think one of this book's kind of claims to fame is that it was one of Brandon Sanderson's early fantasy reads. And I think one of the books that really got him into fantasy, either reading or perhaps also writing. And it is the story, it's called Dragonsbane, which is kind of a little bit misleading because it's the story of a young, or actually not a young, a middle-aged witch named Jenny, who is in a romantic relationship and is the mother of the children of a man named John, who is known throughout the country as a Dragonsbane. So earlier in his life, John slew a dragon and was given the honor of having to protect this holding, which has become, in the years that have since passed, very rundown and impoverished. And he is known throughout the country as the Slayer of the Dragon, or the Dragon's Bane. And this story opens up with a young man seeking out John and instead colliding with Jenny because he is looking for the Dragon's Bane to come back to the capital and slay another dragon. And that is all that I'm really going to tell you about the plot, because this is a very short and concise novel. I think anything else would be venturing into spoiler territory. But what I really liked about this book, and what is really unique about it in comparison to some of the other works of fantasy that I have read, is that, number one, it focuses on a woman who is out of her 20s, who has lived life, who is the mother of 2 children. It talks about motherhood in terms of some of the things that you might regret, some of the things that you have given up about your personal identity, which is, I know, something that many mothers can identify with. The title of mom sometimes can take over your identity and erase all of the other parts of you. And it's a really good exploration of regret and consequences of choices. And the character of Jenny is fascinating. I really, really liked following her. And as I said, this is much less about the Dragon's Bane of John and more about the character of Jenny. This was, again, a really enjoyable read. I think in terms of classic fantasy, this is definitely one worth picking up. And sometimes it's fun, if you're a fan of Brandon Sanderson, for example, it's fun to pick up the books that have inspired the authors that you love so much. I know that I really like doing that for some of my favorite authors. And if you are debating whether or not you would like to pick this one up, I thought that it was really enjoyable. Book 5 of the month was my favorite book, so I think Archer's Goon would have taken this title if I had not read this book, which is East of Eden by John Steinbeck. So John Steinbeck is an author that I have really liked for a long time. I loved Of Mice and Men, which I read around high school time, and I loved The Grapes of Wrath, which I read, I think, the summer of my first year of university. Really enjoyed both those books. I think that Steinbeck, again, in terms of those modern classics or literary fiction, he has a very approachable style. His writing is very easy to digest, but also very beautiful. And not beautiful, it is not overly flowery. It is not chock full of metaphors or poetic language. It is a very straightforward, accessible style that seems to capture the essence of what he wants to talk about without having to resort to that poetic language. I think his writing style is beautiful, especially in terms of describing setting. East of Eden is a story that takes place in the Salinas Valley of California, and he really brings that setting to life. The way that he describes the land, the relationship that the characters have with the land, the setting almost becomes a character in and of itself, and it's very, very beautiful to read. For anybody who hasn't read East of Eden, it is what John Steinbeck referred to as his one novel. He perceived it as his magnum opus, and it was definitely a commercial success when he released it. It is an intergenerational story that focuses on 2 families whose histories were intertwined and how the members of that family are kind of intertwined throughout the generations. It is a retelling of the book of Genesis, and its exploration of themes is definitely a bit on the nose. Actually, when this was released, it didn't get the best critical reception, despite the fact that it had a really generous popular reception. Critics felt that the themes were too simplistic, that you didn't have to work hard enough to read it, that the exploration of good and evil was a little bit too heavy-handed. And I think that opinions have since shifted and changed. This has obviously remained a very beloved book. And I would argue that those things don't always need to be hidden or shadowed. You don't need to have to work hard for a book to be worthwhile or for themes to be worth exploring. Sometimes it's really nice to work hard and to dig deep and to kind of parse through those layers that an author has laid out for you. But sometimes, and I think that this is very much the case of East of Eden, a book can just be enjoyable even though you know what the author was striving for. This, I personally think, is one of the best books that I have ever read. I could not stop reading it once I had started, and I loved it. I would recommend that anybody read it. It is a fantastic book. After East of Eden, I jumped into something a little more lighthearted, and I read the book In Deeper Waters by F.T. Lukens on the day that it was released. And this is a young adult fantasy romance that follows a young boy named Prince Tam and a young boy named Athlin, who he rescues from a pirate barge. Both of these characters, as you follow them throughout the story, you find that they have a lot in common. They both feel like they're outsiders in terms of all the people around them. They find it very difficult to establish connections, and they form a very quick connection with each other. It's definitely, at least I think, aimed at the younger bracket of young adult. There is some romantic content, but it's all very fade to black. It's all very sweet and I think focused on younger readers. It was a very sweet book. It took a couple of hours to read. It was quite short. I didn't think that it stood out above any of the other young adult fantasy romances that I have read, but if you're looking for something that's just very wholesome, very easy to get into, it focuses on some really great family relationships. The siblings in this book have really good relationships with each other. And if you want a book where you know things are going to end well and kind of wrap up well, and you want to have that experience because you've just read something, dark or heartbreaking, then I would definitely recommend it. It is not a favorite of mine. I feel like it was kind of middle of the road, but still highly enjoyable. And the cover is really, really beautiful. The seventh and second to last book that I read in the month of April was The Cycle of the Werewolf by Stephen King. So one of my reading goals for this year was to go back and start reading some of the neglected works of Stephen King that I have not had the chance to get to. And I picked up The Cycle of the Werewolf on a recent trip into the city when I was able to go to the bookstore, and I read it at the end of the month. This is a very short illustrated book. It takes place over 12 very short chapters and follows the cycle of a werewolf that is terrorizing this small town in Maine over the course of 1 year. So every month when the full moon comes, we get to see what the werewolf is plotting, who the werewolf is trying to attack, and what the aftermath of this attack is. It was a really fun book to flip through. The illustrations, my one qualm with the illustrations is that they often showed me what was going to happen before it happened. The illustration would show up on a page, and then what happened during the illustration would take place on the following page, which I didn't really like. But I really liked the illustrations themselves. They were quite good. I would have loved to read this as a full novel. I really liked the story that was underlying, and I think if it had been fleshed out into a full novel, then that would have been really, really enjoyable. But as it was, I thought that it was good. Definitely not amongst my favorite by Stephen King, but totally worthwhile if you want a little mental break and something quick to flick through. And the final book of the month that I listened to, was my nonfiction of the month, and that is The Hidden Lives of Trees by Peter Wohlleben, I think is how you pronounce it. But this is a book that follows a forester who lives in Germany and is writing about his experiences spending his life in the forest, basically. And he talks a lot about our relationship with trees, the way that humans perceive trees, the way that we manage forests, and whether or not that might be a good way to do things. He really gets into some fine details about the internal workings of trees. And a lot of the way that he relates to trees and the way that he describes them gives them almost human attributes, referring to them as parents and children. And I'm not sure that I totally buy into the philosophy of trees as sentient beings in the same way as humans or other animals. But I think that it gave a lot of food for thought. It added a complexity and a sentiency to trees that I had not attributed to them in the past, and did make me think about my relationship with nature, with the outside world. And it did make me consider some of the things that we do that we perceive as being for the good of the forest or for the good of nature that perhaps is quite the opposite. And I think if you really love trees, then this is a great audiobook to listen to. It was only about 7 hours on audio, so probably wasn't even 300 pages. But if you are not really into trees, then I could see your attention flagging during this one, because again, there's a lot of repetition of ideas. It's a lot of these philosophical ponderings about the nature of trees and our relationship to trees. So if you really like that kind of thing, that kind of mindful writing, being at one with nature, then definitely give this a try. But if that is not your cup of tea, then I would probably give this one a skip, because even I found my attention flagging at times, and I really do enjoy trees and being amongst the trees. So it was not an instant hit for me, but I didn't regret the time that I spent listening to this. I am glad that I gave it a listen. And I think that this was a hit when it was released, so obviously there are a ton of people who really love it. But that is it. That is my monthly wrap up for April. As I said, I read some really great books last month. I highly enjoyed my time with many of them, and I would recommend that if any of these sound good to you, to go out and pick them up. I would love to hear your thoughts. If you have read any of these books, then please let me know, because I would love to have your perspective as well. And I will see you with another video soon. Bye.